Why did the room fall silent the moment her name was read? Like everyone suddenly realized they'd been pretending not to notice her. She stood at the edge of the briefing table, hands resting lightly on the steel rim, eyes forward. Not defiant, not afraid, just still. The kind of stillness that unsettled people who were used to noise deciding worth. Lieutenant Jada Roar had been marked early, not officially. Nothing written down at first, just glances, delayed acknowledgments, instructions given a second too late, corrections delivered a second too loudly. She felt it in the timing, in the subtle shifts of tone, the way a drill slowed just enough to make her look hesitant, the way a score landed just low enough to justify another note in a file. She had learned long ago not to argue with the first accusation, or the second, or the third. Arguments created stories, and stories were weapons in the wrong hands. So she focused on breathing, on posture, on showing up. The Pacific wind cut across the concrete training grounds like it had something to prove. Salt in the air, metal clanging, shouted times echoing off barriers. It was supposed to feel routine, but nothing here ever was for her. She wasn't trying to become one of them. That was the irony. She'd already worn different patches, different commands, different kinds of nights. She was here because someone higher up believed integration mattered, believed experience didn't belong to one pipeline. Someone lower down disagreed. The failures came in small pieces, a delayed call-out, a partner who broke formation, a mark written as hesitation instead of discipline. Every time she waited for confirmation before entering, they called it fear. Every time she adjusted for coverage, they called it confusion. She noticed who never got those notes. And she noticed who was always holding the clipboard. Still, she didn't flinch. She wrote everything down in a weather-stained notebook she kept folded into her pocket. Times, names, discrepancies, not for revenge, for memory. Memory was its own kind of armor. By the end of the first week, the word risk had begun to follow her like a shadow. And yet she passed every drill. Not loudly, not impressively, just clean, efficient, unremarkable in the way professionals often are. That should have been the end of it. It was. The gauntlet came on a gray morning when even the ocean looked tired. 5 stages, fatigue by design, confusion by intent, the kind of drill meant to strip people down to instinct. She moved second, no theatrics, no stretching for attention, just a quiet nod to the range officer. Mud dragged at her boots, smoke burned the back of her throat, her breathing stayed steady, her hands didn't rush. She adjusted, compensated, moved on. By the time she crossed the final line, her time was clean. Not record-breaking, just right. That's when the call came. Over pace. The word landed wrong. Everyone felt it. A few heads turned. Someone checked a timer again like maybe they'd misheard. She didn't react. She stepped back into formation, pulled out her notebook and drew a small square in the corner of the page. Another tally, another quiet truth logged away. What she didn't see was the man watching from above, arms folded, eyes narrowing not at her, but at the pattern forming around her. 2 days later, they paired her deliberately wrong. Inside the structure, everything fractured at once. Comms crossed. Her partner miscalled positions. Her weapon stuttered when it shouldn't have. The role player resisted harder than protocol allowed. She adapted, slowed when needed, pressed when necessary, finished the extraction anyway. The report didn't reflect any of that. It listed confusion, loss of control, poor judgment. This time the silence broke. Soft at first, a murmur, a correction spoken just loud enough to be heard. She felt her hands tremble afterward, not from fear, but from restraint, from the effort it took to remain quiet when the truth was standing in plain view. The breaking point didn't come in a firefight. It came in a circle of sand. The belt drill was supposed to test trust, controlled force, clear boundaries. Her partner stepped too close. The first hit wasn't part of the drill, neither was the second. By the third, protocol allowed response. She moved cleanly, redirected, neutralized. The accusation came instantly. Escalation. The word echoed before the dust had settled. She froze, not in fear but disbelief. Her hands hadn't gone near her weapon. Her breathing hadn't spiked. She'd done exactly what the manual described. The order to stop cut through the air. Then another voice did. Calm, measured, final. My office now. She didn't look back as she walked off the line, but she felt it, the shift. 30 men no longer sure who had just failed whom. The office was colder than the field, sparse, intentional. She sat, waited. Footage played without sound, drill after drill, angle after angle, her movements steady, the inconsistencies around her suddenly obvious when seen together. Then the belt drill, slowed, clarified. The commander finally spoke. They failed you. It wasn't comfort, it wasn't praise, it was recognition. He opened a drawer and slid something across the desk. A service weapon. She didn't touch it. Decide, he said, if you're ready to be trusted when no one's watching. She reached out, checked it, handled it like she'd done 1,000 times before. No ceremony, no hunger, just familiarity. If they won't train you right, he said quietly, then I will. The private evaluation wasn't about proving dominance. There were no timers, no witnesses. Just movement, correction, pressure applied without warning. She responded without escalation, without hesitation. When it ended, they stood breathing heavier, not from exhaustion but from understanding. You've been holding back, he said. Because escalation becomes the story, she answered, and some people only want one version. The next morning, the formation felt different. No one said her name with certainty. Until he did. All prior evaluations were suspended, independent oversight ordered, retests scheduled. No arguments allowed. She ran first. Nothing obstructed her this time. The numbers spoke clearly. Others followed. Some faltered without someone else to blame. By the end of the day, no one questioned what had been happening. The debrief was brief, consequences precise. No speeches, no theatrics. Just accountability. She stood unseen at the back of the room, not needing vindication, just closure. Later in the gear bay, the air smelled like oil and routine, normal again. An older operator stopped beside her. You carried yourself right, he said. That matters. She nodded once. Nothing more needed. When she walked out that afternoon, orders tucked quietly into her pack, there was no applause, no announcement. Just space. And sometimes that's the clearest sign of respect. Because dignity doesn't announce itself. It simply acts. Why did the air feel heavier the moment she stepped back onto the range? Like the ground itself remembered what everyone else was trying to forget. Jada felt it before anyone spoke. The pause, the slight delay before instructions, the way eyes tracked her not with curiosity anymore but calculation. The accusation from the belt drill hadn't faded. It had fermented. Some assumed she was already done. Others assumed she'd survive but carry a stain. Both assumptions were wrong, but she didn't correct them. She had learned that silence unsettled people far more than defense ever could. The morning unfolded with mechanical precision. Weapons checked, stations assigned, voices clipped and professional. Yet beneath it all ran a current of unease, not about the drills but about her, about what she represented now. A question no one wanted to ask out loud. What if the problem hadn't been her at all? She moved through warm-ups with the same restraint she'd practiced for years. No wasted motion, no visible tension. Inside, though, something churned. Not anger, not fear, something closer to fatigue. the kind that came from carrying patience longer than most people carried grudges. She remembered other mornings, different bases, different accents, places where mistakes weren't documented, only survived. Back then, competence had been enough. Here, competence had turned into a threat. The first drill of the day was supposed to be routine, close quarters movement under limited visibility. Fog machines thickened the air until shapes became suggestions. Voices echoed wrong. Distance lied. Perfect conditions for confusion. She was placed mid-stack, not lead, not rear, a position that required trust from both directions. The call to move came half a second late. She noticed, adjusted, covered the gap without breaking flow. The room cleared clean, no collisions, no crossed lanes. The after-action note still read, delayed response. She felt something tighten in her chest, not sharp enough to show, not loud enough to hear, just present. Between rotations, she sat on a crate, elbows on knees, helmet resting beside her. Sweat cooled on her skin as she flipped open her notebook. The pages were damp, edges curled, but the writing was clear. Dates, times, patterns. She didn't write complaints, she wrote facts. A boot stopped in front of her. She looked up. It was one of the quiet ones, an operator who'd passed years ago and now floated between instruction and observation. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded toward the notebook. "Smart," he said finally. She didn't respond. He hesitated, then added, "Not everyone keeps receipts." She met his eyes. There was no challenge there, just something like regret. When he walked away, she didn't feel encouraged. She felt heavier, because acknowledgement, when it came too late, often carried its own kind of sadness. The next evolution was endurance-based, weighted movement over uneven ground, the kind of drill that punished shortcuts and rewarded packing. She set her pace deliberately, not fast, sustainable. Halfway through, someone surged ahead too early and burned out. Another twisted an ankle and had to be pulled. She kept moving, breathing steady, eyes forward. At the finish, she wasn't first. She wasn't last. She was exactly where someone with experience knew to be. The mark still landed low. That night, she lay on her bunk staring at the underside of the mattress above her. The barracks were quiet in the way only military sleeping quarters ever were, too quiet, punctuated by distant coughs and the hum of ventilation. She thought about calling someone, a former teammate, a mentor, anyone who knew her before this place started trying to define her. She didn't. Not because she lacked support, but because she needed to know she could still carry herself without borrowing strength. The next day brought live blank scenarios, stress layered on stress, shouted commands, flashbang simulations, bodies moving too close for comfort. She was paired again with someone who didn't quite meet her eyes. Inside the structure, sound collapsed inward. Her world narrowed to angles and breath and movement. She cleared her sector, held, waited for the signal that didn't come. She advanced anyway, because sometimes hesitation was riskier than action. They finished clean. Outside, the debrief twisted the sequence just enough to suggest recklessness. That was when something inside her finally cracked, not outward, not visibly, but inward, a small fracture in the belief that patience alone would be enough. She didn't want to fight back. She wanted it to stop. At lunch, she sat alone, not because she'd been excluded, but because isolation felt easier than conversation loaded with subtext. She picked at her food without tasting it. Across the room, laughter erupted. She didn't look, she didn't need to. A tray clattered beside her. Someone sat. "You good?" the voice asked. She recognized it, one of the newer candidates, young, still unshaped. She considered the question, how honesty could spread faster than control, how words could be used against both speaker and listener. "I'm fine," she said finally. He nodded, accepting it without pushing. That alone felt rare. "You know," he added carefully, Some of us see it. She met his gaze then, really looked. He swallowed, just saying. When he left, she felt something unfamiliar stir, not validation, responsibility. Because when people started watching, staying silent became more complicated. The final drill of the week was announced without ceremony, a composite evaluation, multiple failures counted cumulatively, no resets. She slept poorly the night before, not from nerves, but from anticipation, from knowing that whatever happened next would set a trajectory she couldn't easily redirect. The field was damp that morning, clouds hung low, everything felt compressed. She took her place. The whistle blew. She moved. Everything around her seemed to conspire toward friction. Equipment snagged, calls overlapped, a door jammed where it hadn't before. She adapted, she always did. By the time it ended, her muscles burned and her jaw ached from clenching restraint. The score came back. Borderline. Enough to justify continued observation, enough to keep the pressure on. That night, she stood alone near the perimeter fence, watching the ocean swallow the last of the light. The horizon blurred until sky and water were indistinguishable. She thought about walking away. Not quitting, not failing. Choosing. The thought scared her more than anything else. Because leaving meant they'd never have to admit what they'd done. And staying meant enduring something designed to erode you quietly. Her radio crackled behind her. "Lieutenant." She turned. A silhouette stood a few steps back, upright, unhurried. "Commander wants a word," the voice said. Her first instinct wasn't relief. It was dread. Because conversations at that level rarely existed to comfort. They existed to conclude. She nodded once and followed. As she walked, she felt the weight of every unspoken thing pressing in. Every moment she'd chosen restraint over reaction. Every time she'd let the narrative drift because correcting it felt louder than surviving it. She didn't know yet that the room she was about to enter would change the direction of everything. She only knew that whatever happened next, she would meet it the same way she'd met everything else so far. Steady, silent, still standing. Why did the hallway feel longer on the walk to the commander's office? Like every step was a quiet verdict being delayed on purpose. Jada kept her pace even, not slow enough to look hesitant, not fast enough to look eager. The corridor lights hummed softly overhead, reflecting off polished floors that had seen thousands of boots pass with different outcomes attached to them. Careers had turned in these hallways, so had reputations. She reminded herself to breathe. In through the nose, out through the mouth, controlled, measured, the same way she handled recoil, the same way she handled pressure. The door closed behind her, with a sound that felt heavier than it should have. The office was sparse. No motivational slogans, no framed photographs of past glories, just clean lines, a metal desk, a chair placed deliberately in front of it, and the quiet presence of a man who didn't look up right away. Commander Cade Ryland studied a file as if it were something fragile, something that could cut. She stood where protocol told her to stand. "Sit," he said finally, without looking up. She did. Silence stretched, not uncomfortable, intentional, the kind used by people who understood that waiting often revealed more than speaking. When he finally looked at her, his eyes weren't sharp with suspicion. They were tired, the fatigue of someone who'd seen too many good people worn down by small, unaddressed failures of leadership. "You know why you're here," he said. She considered several answers, chose none. "Yes, sir," she said instead. He nodded, as if that was enough. Then he turned a small remote over in his hand and pressed a button. A monitor on the wall came to life. Footage filled the screen. Her footage. Angles she'd never seen. Overhead, body cam, helmet feeds synced together. The drills unfolded without commentary. No annotations, no scores, just motion and context. She watched herself wait for a signal that never came. Step anyway. Cover a sector left exposed by someone else. Adjust grip when a weapon stuttered. Stabilize a role player resisting beyond protocol. Then the belt drill. The slowed playback made it unmistakable. The first contact, the second, the third. Her response measured, contained, corrective. Ryland didn't speak while it played. When it ended, he leaned back slightly. "You ever wonder why silence bothers certain people?" he asked. She met his gaze. "Because it doesn't give them anything to use." A corner of his mouth tightened, not quite a smile. "You've been documenting," he said. "Yes, sir." "Why?" She paused, not because she didn't know, but because the truth mattered here. "Because facts don't escalate," she said. "They wait." He studied her for a long moment. "They've been failing you," he said finally, "not the other way around." The words landed with weight, not relief, not vindication, something closer to gravity shifting. She didn't nod, didn't react. He opened a drawer. The sound was soft, controlled. He placed a service weapon on the desk between them, turned so the grip faced her. Her eyes flicked to it, then back to him. "I'm not testing your marksmanship," he said quietly. "I'm testing judgment." She didn't reach for it. "Every operator eventually faces a moment," he continued, "where authority disappears. No oversight, no witnesses, just decision." He slid it a fraction closer. "I need to know who you are in that moment." The room felt smaller, not threatening, focused. She reached out and picked it up. The motion was automatic. Safety check. Chamber clear, finger indexed. Muzzle down. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She handed it back. Ryland watched her closely. "You didn't ask permission." "No, sir." "You didn't hesitate either." "No, sir." He nodded once, decisive. "If they won't train you without bias," he said, "then I will." The training bay was empty when they entered. No observers, no clipboards, just steel, rubber mats, and quiet. "This isn't on the schedule," he said, "and it won't be documented." She nodded. He handed her a modified rifle, different balance, different optic. "Adapt," he said simply. The first sequence came without warning. Targets emerged unevenly, distances misaligned. She adjusted, fired, moved. A reload forced behind partial cover. She didn't fumble, didn't rush. A simulated ambush triggered overhead. She dropped, rolled, corrected, fired from prone. Ryland circled her slowly, not judging, studying. Then he closed distance fast, hand reaching for her sling. She reacted instantly, rotated, redirected, locked him in place without striking. She released the moment she recognized him. "Perfect," he said. They moved into hand-to-hand next. Controlled, purposeful, not to dominate but to understand. "Who trained you?" he asked between exchanges. She hesitated, not from fear, from loyalty. "Task Force Phoenix," she said at last. "Liaison work, recovery operations." His eyes sharpened, recognition flickered. "That explains the restraint," he said, "and the discipline." They finished without ceremony, both breathing heavier than before. "You've been carrying more than they see," he said. "Yes, sir." "And you didn't use it." "No, sir." He studied her, then nodded slowly. "That ends now." The next morning, the field felt different before anyone spoke. Formation assembled, loose, uneasy. Rumors had moved faster than orders. She stood where she was told, eyes forward. Ryland stepped into view. "Effective immediately," he said calmly. "All previous evaluations are suspended." A ripple moved through the ranks. "There will be a full retest," he continued. "Independent oversight, external evaluators, no internal instruction." Someone shifted, someone swallowed. You failed your duty to fairness, he added, eyes fixed forward. Step aside. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. The retest began before noon. She went first. Nothing interfered this time. She moved clean, efficient, accurate. The numbers spoke without commentary. Others followed. Some faltered when the narrative no longer protected them. By the end of the day, the truth stood unchallenged. The debrief was brief, consequences precise. No raised voices, no appeals. Later, alone again, she sat on a bench in the gear bay, reassembling her kit. The room smelled like oil and routine, familiar, grounding. A senior operator stopped nearby, looked at her without judgment. You held your line, he said quietly. That's rare. She nodded once. When she left that evening, orders folded into her pack. There was no celebration. Just space. And for the first time since arriving, the silence felt earned, not imposed. Because sometimes strength isn't proven by how loudly you fight back. Sometimes it's proven by how long you refuse to disappear. Why did the quiet after accountability feel louder than all the accusations that came before? Jada noticed it the moment the evaluations ended. The absence of tension didn't feel like relief. It felt unfamiliar, like stepping off a moving deck onto solid ground and realizing your balance had been compensating for longer than you knew. People moved differently now. Not carefully, honestly. Conversations paused when she passed, not out of avoidance, but adjustment, as if everyone was recalibrating where to place their assumptions. She didn't mistake it for acceptance. Acceptance was noisy. This was something else. Space. The reassignment order sat folded in her pack, its weight more psychological than physical. Temporary attachment, prototype detachment, combat liaison, vague enough to unsettle people who needed boxes, precise enough for someone who understood intent over labels. That night's sleep didn't come easily, not because she was anxious, but because her mind no longer needed to stay guarded. The alertness she'd carried like a second spine had nowhere to rest yet. She lay on her back, listening to the building settle, replaying moments she'd swallowed whole over the past weeks, not to relive them, to let them go. Before dawn, she was up. The base felt different in the early hours, less performative, more honest. She ran along the perimeter where the concrete met sand, breath sinking with footfall, thoughts thinning with each mile. The ocean rolled beside her, steady, indifferent. It didn't care who passed selection. It didn't keep score. That constancy grounded her. When she returned, the message was waiting. Briefing 700, restricted attendance. The room was smaller than she expected. No ranks displayed. No seating hierarchy. Just a table, a screen, and 5 people who didn't introduce themselves until it mattered. Ryland stood off to the side, letting someone else speak first. That alone told her this wasn't about authority, it was about alignment. They spoke in fragments, operational gaps, friction points between units, missions where coordination failed quietly, then catastrophically. The kind of failures that never made headlines because the consequences were absorbed by the people on the ground. We need someone who can move between worlds, one of them said, without ego, without needing credit. Jada listened, asked clarifying questions, didn't sell herself. At the end, Ryland looked at her. You're not here to fix people, he said. You're here to expose systems. She nodded, that she understood. Her first task wasn't glamorous. Observation, embedded assessment, watching how information moved, or didn't, through a joint training exercise scheduled later that week. She was there to listen more than speak, to notice who talked over whom, where assumptions replaced confirmation. She wore no distinguishing patch, no title announced. At first, people mistook her for admin, then for support. Then, gradually, they stopped trying to place her at all. That was when the real conversation started. She noticed how junior operators hesitated before correcting seniors, even when they were right. how decisions defaulted upward even when time didn't allow it, how certain voices filled silence while others learned to shrink around it. She didn't interrupt, she wrote. During a live iteration, a misaligned call nearly caused a cascade failure. She stepped in, not with authority but clarity, reframed the problem, redirected flow, no raised voice, no reprimand. The room reset. Afterwards, someone pulled her aside. "You didn't make that about rank," he said. She shrugged. The problem didn't belong to rank. Word spread slowly, not as hype, as consistency. Back at Coronado, the atmosphere continued to evolve. The people who'd once dictated tone now moved carefully, aware of oversight that didn't announce itself but never blinked. Training became quieter, more deliberate, less performative. She crossed paths once with someone who'd laughed during her early drills. The laughter was gone now, replaced with something like uncertainty. He nodded, she nodded back. Nothing more. The most difficult moment came unexpectedly. A junior candidate approached her after a long day, nervous, hands fidgeting. "Ma'am," he said, then corrected himself. "Lieutenant, can I ask you something?" She waited. "How did you know when to speak up?" he asked, "and when not to?" She considered the question carefully. "You don't," she said finally. "You decide what you're willing to carry if you don't." He nodded slowly, as if that answer weighed more than he expected. That night she reviewed her notes. Patterns emerged, not of individuals but of incentives, how systems rewarded noise over accuracy, speed over understanding, confidence over competence. She sent her findings up the chain without commentary. Let the data speak. The response came faster than she expected. Implementation trials, adjusted protocols, new oversight structures. Not dramatic, incremental. Effective. Weeks passed, her presence became normal, then necessary, then quietly valued. One evening, as the sun dipped low, she stood again near the perimeter fence. Same spot as before, different weight inside her chest, not lighter, truer. Ryland joined her without announcement. "You did good work," he said. She didn't respond immediately. "They won't thank you for all of it," he added. "I didn't come here for that," she said. He nodded, "I know." They stood in silence for a while, comfortable this time. "You ever regret not fighting louder?" he asked. She thought about the belt drill, the false marks, the temptation to explode just once so they'd have to acknowledge her. "No," she said, "because then I'd be arguing their story." He smiled faintly. That might be the most dangerous kind of discipline. When her temporary assignment ended, there was no ceremony, just a quiet extension offer and a choice. She took the extension. Not because she needed redemption, but because she'd found something worth protecting. On her last night before moving to the new detachment full-time, she packed slowly, folding gear, checking straps. The ritual steadied her. As she zipped the pack, she paused, thought about the service weapon on the desk weeks ago, the question behind it. Who are you when no one's watching? She had her answer now. She was the same. And sometimes that was enough to change everything. Why did it feel harder to leave a place that had tried so quietly to erase her? The morning she prepared to move fully into the detachment, the base woke the same way it always did, whistles, engines, distant cadence. But something inside her resisted the rhythm. Not because she'd grown attached to the ground beneath her boots, but because this place had marked a turning. It had tested not just her capability, but her restraint. Walking away felt less like departure and more like closing a chapter she hadn't known she was writing while it unfolded. She loaded her gear with deliberate care, each strap checked, each pocket accounted for. The habits were automatic, but her thoughts were not. They drifted back to the first week. The glances, the failed marks that didn't match reality, the way silence had been mistaken for weakness. She paused, hands resting on the pack, and let the memory pass without gripping it. Outside, the transport vehicle waited. No send-off, no audience, just a driver scrolling through something on a screen, unaware he was ferrying someone who'd quietly shifted the gravity of a system. As the vehicle rolled out, she watched the familiar structures slide past. The range, the obstacle rigs, the catwalk where Rylan had stood the first time he really saw what was happening. She didn't feel triumph. She felt clarity, and clarity, she'd learned, was far rarer. The detachment operated out of a facility that didn't announce itself. No signage, no ceremonial gates, just a nondescript building set back from the rest like it preferred not to be noticed. Inside, the atmosphere was different immediately. Less noise, fewer assumptions. People spoke when they had something to say. Silence wasn't filled just to prove presence. Her introduction was brief. No resume recitation, no dramatic framing. "This is Lieutenant Rohr," Ryland said simply. "She's here to observe and advise." That was it. No one asked where she'd come from. No one asked what she'd endured. They watched how she listened, how she moved, how she chose not to interrupt. The first week was all intake, sitting in on briefings, reading after-action reports others skimmed, asking questions that didn't accuse but clarified. She didn't challenge conclusions directly. She asked how they'd been reached. At first, the room resisted, not openly, subtly, the way people defend familiar processes because changing them feels like admitting fault. But she stayed steady. During a simulation review, a pattern emerged, missions stalling not because of bad execution, but because of delayed trust. Units waiting for confirmation that never came. Overcorrection disguised as caution. She pointed it out quietly. No speech, no recommendation yet, just the observation. Someone frowned, someone else leaned forward. They ran the next iteration, with adjusted autonomy. The difference was immediate. That night she sat alone at a metal desk, replaying the footage. She felt something unfamiliar bloom beneath her ribs, not pride, relief, the kind that comes when effort meets openness instead of resistance. Still, not everything changed smoothly. There were moments, small, sharp ones, when she felt the old reflex stir. A tone in someone's voice, a dismissive glance, the suggestion that she was support, not strategy. Each time she noticed it without reacting, not because it didn't matter, but because she knew what reacting would cost. One afternoon, during a planning session that had stretched too long, a senior operator cut her off mid-sentence. "We've already covered that," he said, impatience creeping in. She paused, let the silence expand. "Then we missed it," she replied evenly, "because it's still happening." The room stilled. He studied her for a second, then nodded. "Go on." It wasn't an apology, it was better. Later, he approached her privately. "You don't push," he said, "you hold." She didn't know whether it was a compliment or an observation, maybe both. As weeks turned into months, her role evolved without formal announcement. She was asked for input earlier, consulted before conclusions hardened, trusted with nuance, not because she demanded space, but because she used it well when given. One evening, after a long day of simulations, she found herself back near a perimeter fence. Different location, same instinct, the habit of standing where edges met open space. She thought about the version of herself who'd stood like this before, wondering whether to stay or leave, whether silence was costing her more than speaking ever could. She smiled faintly at the memory, not because it was over, but because she'd survived it without becoming someone she didn't recognize. Her radio crackled. "Lieutenant," Ryland's voice came through. "You have a minute." She did. They met in a quiet room overlooking the training floor. He didn't sit behind a desk this time. He leaned against a railing, watching a team reset after a failed iteration. "They're listening to you," he said. She followed his gaze. "They're listening to the work." He nodded. "That's why I brought you here." There was a pause. "You ever think about what would have happened if you'd exploded back then?" he asked. She considered it honestly. "They would have been right," she said. "Not about the failure, about the risk." He smiled, not amused, appreciative. "Restraint is hard to teach," he said, "especially in places that confuse aggression for strength." She didn't respond right away. "I wasn't being restrained for them," she said finally. "I was doing it for me." That he understood. The offer came quietly. Extended assignment, expanded authority, no change in rank yet, just responsibility. She accepted without ceremony. Not because it validated her, but because it aligned with what she believed mattered now. On her first official day in the expanded role, she addressed a mixed group of operators and analysts. No speech prepared, just a few sentences. "We're not here to prove who's toughest," she said. "We're here to reduce the cost of being wrong." That was it. No applause, just nods. Later, alone again, she sat and wrote in her notebook, the same one she'd carried through sabotage and silence. The pages were nearly full now. She didn't write grievances anymore. She wrote observations, improvements, names of people who'd stepped up when it mattered. At the bottom of the last page, she paused, then wrote a single line, not as a note but as a reminder. "Composure is a choice you make before anyone asks you to." She closed the notebook and slipped it back into her pack. Outside, the day continued. Drills ran, voices carried, systems adjusted. And somewhere in the quiet, a lesson had taken root, not announced, not celebrated, but solid. That dignity doesn't demand the spotlight. It simply refuses to disappear. Why did the final decision arrive not with urgency, but with a calm that felt heavier than any command she'd ever received? Jada read the message twice, not because it was unclear, but because clarity sometimes needed time to settle. Permanent placement, expanded operational authority, a role that didn't exist on paper a year ago, shaped instead by gaps that had finally been acknowledged. The words were measured, deliberate, no congratulations attached, just expectation. She folded the message and sat back, letting the chair creak beneath her weight. Around her, the detachment moved with its usual low-volume efficiency. Conversation stayed close to the bone. No one lingered in ego. That, more than anything, told her she'd chosen the right place to stay. Still, the decision carried a quiet gravity. Permanence meant responsibility that didn't rotate out. It meant owning not just outcomes, but cultures. And cultures, she knew, resisted change far more fiercely than individuals ever did. She stepped outside into the late afternoon light. The air was warm, dry, almost gentle, a contrast to the sharp coastal winds where this story had begun. She walked without direction for a while, letting the rhythm of her steps organize her thoughts. She thought about the younger version of herself, the one who believed competence would always be enough, the one who hadn't yet learned how often systems protected themselves at the expense of truth. She didn't feel bitterness toward that version, only compassion. Growth, she'd learned, wasn't about becoming harder. It was about becoming clearer. Her first act in the new role wasn't dramatic. It was a review, quiet, thorough. She pulled together representatives from units that rarely sat at the same table, not to interrogate, but to listen. She asked them where things broke when no one was watching, where friction lived quietly until it became failure. At first, the room spoke in abstractions: process, timing, resources. She waited. Eventually, someone said what had been circling the edges. "Trust," he admitted. "We hesitate because we don't know who has our back when things go wrong." Heads nodded slowly, not in agreement but in recognition. Jada didn't respond immediately. She let the weight of the admission sit where it landed. "Trust isn't built by rank," she said finally. "It's built by consistency, by doing the same thing when no one's evaluating you." The conversation shifted after that, became less defensive, more honest. That pattern repeated over the weeks that followed. Not every room welcomed it. Some resisted quietly, some openly. She learned to distinguish between fear of change and fear of exposure. She treated them differently. There were setbacks, a revised protocol ignored, a recommendation sidelined, old habits resurfacing under stress. Each time, she addressed it the same way she always had. With facts, with patience, with an unwillingness to perform outrage. One night after a particularly long day, she sat alone in the dim glow of a briefing room, reviewing footage from a joint exercise that had gone sideways. No injuries, no headlines, just inefficiency that could have cost lives under different conditions. She paused the footage and leaned back, rubbing her eyes. For the first time in a long while, she felt tired, not physically, but emotionally. The kind of tired that came from carrying responsibility without spectacle, from being the steady presence rather than the visible hero. She wondered briefly if anyone noticed. Then she smiled to herself. That question no longer mattered. The next morning she received an unexpected request. A candidate from an earlier cycle wanted to speak with her, not officially, just advice. They met near the edge of the facility where training noise softened into distance. I almost quit, he admitted. Not because I couldn't do it, because I felt invisible. She listened without interrupting. How did you keep going? He asked. She considered the question carefully. She didn't want to offer a slogan or a shortcut. I stopped trying to be seen, she said, and focused on being useful. Eventually, the right people noticed. He nodded slowly, and the wrong ones. They always do, she replied, eventually. When he left, she stood there a moment longer, watching him disappear back into the noise. She hoped he'd remember the conversation when things got hard again, not because it would make it easier, but because it might make it clearer. Months passed. The changes she'd helped initiate began to show results. Fewer miscommunications, faster recoveries, less reliance on bravado to cover uncertainty, nothing flashy, nothing cinematic. Just better outcomes. One afternoon, Ryland found her reviewing data in silence. You know, he said casually, some people still do like how you operate. She didn't look up. I'd be worried if they did. He chuckled softly. They say you don't react enough. She finally met his eyes. I react, I just don't perform. He nodded, satisfied. There came a day when she returned briefly to Coronado for a joint assessment. Same grounds, same concrete pads, different energy, new instructors, revised oversight, a quieter discipline in the air. As she walked the perimeter, someone she didn't recognize nodded to her. Not exaggerated, not deferential, just acknowledgement. She paused near the catwalk where everything had shifted once before. The memory rose unbidden. The early mornings, the false marks, the service weapon laid calmly on a desk. She didn't feel anger anymore. She felt distance. That night alone again, she opened her notebook. The same one, worn, reliable, nearly full. She flipped through earlier pages, the tallies, the silent records, evidence of endurance she'd once needed to survive. She turned to the last blank page. For a long moment, she didn't write. Then she did. Not a report, not a lesson. A reflection. She wrote about restraint, about the danger of mistaking volume for truth, about how institutions changed not when they were attacked, but when they were shown a mirror they couldn't ignore. She closed the notebook gently and set it aside. Outside, the lights of the base glowed steadily against the dark. People moved through their routines. Training continued. Mistakes would still be made. That was inevitable. But something fundamental had shifted. Not because someone had shouted. Not because someone had broken the system. But because someone had refused to let the system break them. Jada stood and shouldered her pack, feeling its familiar weight settle evenly across her back. She moved forward, not into spotlight, not into silence, but into purpose. Because in the end, strength didn't announce itself. It endured. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.